Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo! And speaking of a great wahoo, today is a day that we are celebrating a particularly spectacular wahoo. Yes, indeed, folks. You are watching the 75th episode of the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. "75 episodes. Why, that's 1.4423 years. Getting pretty darn close to a year and a half of your beer drinking guide showing you the way around the Great Wahoo. And in those 75 episodes spanning close to a year and a half, there have only been 13 reruns. That's right, folks, only 13. That's only 17% of the shows. So take that, Mr. Fancy Pants David Letterman, with your 1-hour TV show that you only have to produce 20 minutes of because the rest is ads. I'd like to see you do only 17% reruns. And folks, I went exploring and found out that 75th episodes are celebrated as a Diamond Jubilee. This is official. You can look it up under anniversaries. Just go Google. So, since this is the Diamond Jubilee, this is the perfect time for you to go gather up all those diamonds that you're not using. You know, the ex's ring, grandma's jewelry, whatever's laying around and you just never get around to using. Let me know, and I'll send you a free confidential envelope so you can send me all that unused jewelry in order to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of our 75th episode. Send in your diamonds to celebrate the 75th episode of the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. You will feel good about it. And so will I promise. And now, let's enjoy the 75th episode of the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. It's time to drive Steens Mountain. Good old Oregon. It's known for the Willamette Valley and the coast. But out here on the eastern side of Oregon, there's a big hole that I always thought was just filled with desert. Lordy, was I ever wrong about that. There's some great country just waiting for a little 1 or 2 or 3 day drive right in our back door. A good excuse to go adventuring in this country is driving to the top of Steens Mountain. The Steens Mountains are the ones that you see off to the west as you drive from Winnemucca to Jordan Valley. Getting to the top of Steens Mountain itself can be rather difficult because of snow. For that reason, I decided to go in July of the year 2008. 2 episodes ago, we actually got to the very tippy top of Steens Mountain. And in our last episode, we began driving the south part of the loop that will take us back to Highway 205. On the 2-mile drive from this junction up to the top of the hill, I had noticed beautiful Big Indian Canyon. After coming back from the very tippy top of the hill, I stopped and looked out over Big Indian Canyon. I did notice off in the far distance, a very interesting feature. We're going to be using the zoom lens to look way out at this far ridge. Right along the top of that far ridge, there is a road. And that road, my friends, is the road we will be driving when we go down from Steens Mountain. Well, I was looking forward to getting to the top of Steens Mountain, and I enjoyed it immensely. I must admit, I was just as much looking forward to the drive down this northern slope of Big Indian Canyon. The road is very, very seriously marked as a rough road, and we can't wait to see just how well we do getting down that 4-mile stretch that not only is the sign warning us about, but every car we pass has had something to say about it. Just so that you have fair warning, please note that where we were looking at the far ridge with the little road scratched out along the top of it is part of the 4-mile stretch that they call the Rooster area. And they warn you not to go over it if you're pulling trailers or if you have a low clearance vehicle. However, that little road that we saw scratched along the top of the mountain is not the rough part of the Rooster area. No. The rough part is around back where we cannot see yet, but we will be seeing it here momentarily. Indeed, last time we went from this intersection over the 6 miles out to the Rooster area. That journey left us looking at this, exactly the road that hangs on to the top of that little area that we saw looking down Big Indian Canyon. Here we stop and look at the road that we've just driven over. We notice all of the alpine flowers growing on this hot July day. And we take a look back up Big Indian Canyon to where we were standing when I used a row of little white arrows to show a road etched in the far distance, the road from which this picture was taken. After a little more hanging onto the side of the cliff, the road comes out into this rather broad spot and it makes a little U-turn. You can see the road continuing there off to the left. At the far end of this U-turn, there's a little place where you can pull out and go on a path to look into Little Blitzen Gorge. We've been driving a little tongue of land with Big Indian Canyon on the south and Little Blitzen Gorge to the north. This trail goes off and lets us look down to the north into Little Blitzen Gorge. After thoroughly enjoying these amazing wildflowers and the gorgeous view, I got back on the road and headed toward what everyone had assured me was the really rough part of the road. Indeed, we did get to the rough part. We're starting on it here. We got to where we were not going nearly this fast. Mostly the problem was there were lots and lots of stones sticking out this steep grade. I know, it doesn't really look all that bad from here, but believe me, when you're driving over these rocks, you do have to take it easy so you don't end up with a busted axle or something else that will strand you out here on Steens Mountain. Down in the valley, we can see the road that we are on after it does the switchback down the side of this hill. As a public service, let me suggest that when you're driving Steens Mountain, you just forget about how dirty your car's going to get. Here we are going around the switchback turn. I think you get the idea. The whole thing was just darned rough. In fact, this little stretch was 4 miles long, and it took me 40 minutes to make it through. That's 1 mile every 10 minutes, meaning we were averaging 6 miles an hour. And I heard myself say on that last clip, "It's steep here, folks." Yes, indeed, it really is. Steeper than it looks. About 10 or 15 minutes from the switchback loop, we got down to where there were more trees. I started talking about, well, maybe we're past the worst of it. But no, we weren't. Of course, part of the fun of driving this was that I had one hand holding the camera in the windshield. It added a little sparkle to the concept of maneuvering around all the rocks and rough spots on this road. I certainly hope you appreciate what your beer drinking guide goes through for you, folks. Finally, we near the bottom of the grade, and the road turns from the rusty brown rocky hillside into a gray that is gravel. And suddenly, the road turns into a highway. We get to zipping right along at 15-20 miles an hour. And finally, when we reach the bottom of the grade altogether, we get onto some really good Oregon dirt roads that let us get up to 40 and even 50. At this point, we are past the 4 miles called the Rooster area. And I must admit, I thoroughly enjoyed the smooth road for the 18 miles out to Highway 205. We pass one of several gates that control access to Steens Mountain through the year. reach Highway 205. With plenty of ditzing around, taking photographs, and checking out the sights, it took us 3.5 hours to get to the top of Steens Mountain. The drive down the mountain, through the Rooster Comb, and the 18 miles on back out to the road, a total of 28 miles, took us a little over 2 hours. 5.5 hours to check out Steens Mountain. And worth every dusty second, if you ask me. Here on the southern loop towards Steens Mountain, it's pretty hard to miss if you're driving up Highway 205. The fact is, there is this really amazing sign pointing the way. After 5.5 hours, I must admit I was glad to be back on pavement, heading south. Now available from your beer drinking guide to the Great Wahoo, you can get DVD movies made up from different stories that have been shown here on the Great Wahoo. So far, there are 4 different DVDs with 7 different movies. There are movies about Boise High, about our sewer system, about the Boise Kelton stage and a drive around the Albion Mountains and the City of Rocks, and there is a DVD on the world's greatest prehistoric river floods, both of which happened right here in Idaho. Your beer drinking guide also has 2 books out, one on building, heating, and remodeling Boise High, and the other on geothermal development here in Boise. These books are rich in historic and contemporary photographs. I can also make custom DVDs of your favorite shows or of stories that have been serialized on the Beer Drinker's Guide. For more information on these movies, these books, or these services, check out my website, www.greatwahoo.com, and feel free to send me an email at beerdrinker@greatwahoo.com. Eduardo was here from the old country, and he was a pretty easygoing guy. There was one thing that he brought with him from the old country, and he loved to do it all his life, and that was to garden. And the one thing that Eduardo was famous for and that he always took great pride in were his tomatoes. Everyone talked about him as well they should. He could grow tomatoes to the roof, and they were all plump and juicy and delicious. And he loved growing them, and he loved eating them. Unfortunately, Eduardo had settled out in kind of a rocky part of the desert down south of Boise, and he missed the good soil back home. And as he got older and older, it got harder and harder for him to garden. Fortunately, Eduardo had a good son named Guido, and Guido got to where he helped more and more in the spring when it was time to turn over the soil and get ready for planting. Unfortunately, Guido was something of a scrapper, and at some point, he found himself in prison. Poor Eduardo. He went out to his garden that spring, and he tried turning over the soil, but he just couldn't do it. It was too much work. And so he wrote to Guido, telling him how much he was missing him, not only because he was his son, but because this year Eduardo didn't think he'd be able to put in his famous tomatoes. It was only a few days later Eduardo got a letter from Guido. And Guido said in his letter, "Oh my gosh, Pop, don't go digging around in the garden. That's where I buried the bodies." Well, apparently Guido wasn't as bright as he thought, because, of course, they censor mail in the prisons, and the very next day There were cops all over Eduardo's front lawn. They brushed past the old man and out to the garden, and the old man sat inside the house, worried sick that now Guido would be up for murder charges and never get home. The police dug, and they dug, and they dug deeper. The sun got hot, and finally they just had to give up. They hadn't been able to find one body. The head detective knocked on Eduardo's door and apologized to him for having worried him so much. Well, Eduardo was certainly relieved, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't help wondering why that Guido had been so dumb as to send a letter like that from prison. The very next day, a letter arrived from Guido. It said, "Hey, Pops, how you doing? Sorry to worry you so much, but considering where I'm at right now, that was the best I could do to help you out with your gardening." And that's the 75th episode, the Diamond Jubilee, of the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for sharing. Hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo!